Thank you all for inviting me. Um, I used to have a Best of Texas backyard habitat habit, but now I'm telling you, it looks pretty ragged out there, just like y'all were talking about ahead of time. It'll be interesting to see what made it through. I will say that I was out walking around this afternoon and there was a bunch of elbow bush that is blooming, and so I thought that was a good sign. Everything else, it looks pretty much dead to me. I mean, it's just nothing's, well, spiderworts are doing pretty well, so that's encouraging too. But anyway, I'll try not to allude to the freeze too much because I'm sure we're all sick of it, and hopefully we'll have better days soon. So in this talk, we are going to look at things that you can do in your yard, and if you don't have a yard, in your green belt or your city park, to help make our environment more healing and safe, really, for birds, and to help them thrive. So I hope that I can get you excited about some of the plants you have not tried, and because together we can really make a big difference for not just birds, but for other wildlife too. And like Lorraine said, we're going to just hold questions till the end, and then we'll go through the chat. So what do birds need to thrive? Well, as you may have noticed during the freeze, they were thirsty. So a few I saw eating a little ice, but generally the big hit was to go out and replenish the bird bath about, every 3 hours or so they could get water to drink, but also to take baths. I had a neighbor email me and say, did my bird just commit suicide? It took a bath. And it's like, yeah, that's really important for feather care. You could tell the birds that were pretty fit because they were still taking care of their feathers and they looked good. And the ones that maybe didn't make it, their feathers were beginning to look pretty beat. And so obviously their insulation wasn't as good, and they were probably not going to make it through the full time. So water is key, whether it's 100 degrees or whether it's 7 degrees. I'd be interested to know how cold y'all got down there, but it was 7 degrees here at our house. The next thing birds need is space, and that's just depends on the species, how much area it needs to cover, whether it's a resident bird and quite happy with, an acre or less, or whether it's a migrant or, golden cheek warbler that needs at least 5 to 7 acres of quality habitat. Just depends on the species. So we will talk a lot about food, shelter, and places to raise young tonight, because those are all the things. So basically, I think that this freeze, we're all tied into the natural world, but a lot of people are not. And I think that the freeze might have given them a better understanding of what wildlife has had to go through, because they were experiencing 35 degrees in their house, some of them, and no water to speak of. So beyond, food, water, shelter, places to raise young, we're going to go through all of these. And we have to say that, there are all sorts of people. By the way, Lorraine, there are all sorts of people coming into the waiting room. So it's coming up on my screen, and maybe if you could handle it, I'm sure they'll be happy to be let in.
Yeah, I'm trying to let them in as soon as I see them.
Okay, thank you. So anyway, here's a cardinal. The birds were so lucky to have all the ash juniper berries, either pre-February, because the birds got here early. We've had an amazing eruption year of birds that we don't normally see, and so the berry crop has been crucial in many birds' survival. And it is getting to the point now where our resources look like they're getting pretty slim. And I imagine birds like the cedar waxwings are going to start moving a little bit more nomadically in order to find food, because they are kind of nomads. So, long before we had feeders for birds, and long before we provided nest boxes to birds, native plants were really meeting birds' needs. Once you get past water and space, native plants are what does the rest. And so I don't know if there's anyone here. I think a lot of you are probably old hands at this, but a native plant is one that's been part of an ecoregion for a long period of time, you know, thousands upon thousands of years. And there are many definitions, but in my case, I just said a plant that was here pre-European settlement would be considered a native plant. And so over that time, the plant has developed relationships with the wildlife that it supports. And that means that they were blooming at the time that the animals needed them, and setting seed at the right times, and providing shelter and providing nesting sites. So that's what these plants do for us and what they do for our wildlife. And so they're here without direct introduction, you know, where somebody said, oh, wouldn't it be great to have ligustrum, or indirect, you know, a mistaken plant that came in that hitched a ride, you know, on a cargo ship. So we do like native plants, and our general storyline for people is to say that, yeah, they're adapted to our droughts and floods, adapted to our soils, as long as you put the right plant in the right spot, generally disease resistant. And in our case, in this talk, we like the fact that they provide habitat and food for wildlife. So if you're not familiar with these two books by Douglas Tallamy, they may be in your library. Bringing Nature Home is an older book where Douglas Tallamy, who's an entomologist at the University of Delaware, basically started promoting native plants, saying things like our non-natives, ligustrum and nanidinas, are like just statues in your yard because they don't provide much, if any, wildlife value, or in the case of both of those, kind of have a tendency to outcompete everything else around them. His new Nature's Best Hope is one that mainly goes more into a lot of the value of native plants towards for insects. And a lot of our plants, as you're aware, kind of provide double or triple duty for the wildlife that they serve. So for example, we've got this pipevine swallowtail on the Lantana urticoides, and it's nectaring there on these platform flowers. And yet a little bit later on, the berries, the fruits set, and birds like our ruby-crowned kinglets move in to take advantage of those. And I've watched ruby-crowned kinglets, I've watched mockingbirds and robins, just one with just like in a foot from me, busy eating berries on that plant. And of course, that's the way that these plants get carried around. Thank goodness we have birds to move them from place to place. In the case of our natives, of course, they always, like you all were saying earlier, move things like ligustrum berries around too. And someone alluded to, you know, we say that our native plants are adapted to our droughts and floods, and what about this freeze? Well, this freeze was extraordinary. And it's interesting, someone was saying that their mountain laurels look terrible. Up here in Austin, our mountain laurels actually look good, at least the ones I've seen in my yard and the ones that I've seen in you know, in this park that I just went to today. But what I'm hearing, especially from just around the state in terms of bird mortality, it's quite patchy. And I am going to hypothesize that it's because you have little micro habitats that were pockets of warm air or less wind contributed to survival, and other places that were so exposed. And there's where the plants and the animals probably, well, we know some of them didn't do so well. So the jury's still out. It'll be interesting to see what happens over the next few months as we even see how did our live oaks come through, for example. But, okay, so I showed you a picture earlier of a cardinal with a yaupon berry, and you know, those kind of bird plant connections, especially seeing the berry eating birds eating berries, is really obvious for people. But here's another bird plant connection that maybe isn't quite so obvious. And I'm assuming that y'all are all proponents of native plants and you're out there talking to the public and trying to get them to see a bigger picture. So I was at the Wildflower Center last August and September working on our uh, Landscape for Birds class for Native Plant Society. And there were so many native bumblebees working this mealy blue sage. And, you know, it's like, oh, that's really great. I'm really happy we're feeding those bumblebees because they're definitely in decline. But they're also there, if you want to think about it, for birds that are bee and wasp specialists, like this summer tanager. So here's the male on the left and the female on the right. And this was going on right outside my window where it looks like a wasp. And so, you know, that's not something that people normally see or appreciate, but these birds are helping keep wasps in check. One positive thing that I've heard may come out of the freeze is that those paper wasps, which are really good predators on our caterpillars, are actually going to be knocked back this spring, and that might give us more of a chance for the critical caterpillar population to come back, because there's been a noticeable decline, at least from Austin down to the valley, of caterpillars, and possibly partially due to the paper wasps we have. So native plants do support, oops, sorry, just letting somebody in from the waiting room. They support a lot of lepidopteran diversity. And that's, if you're not willing to, you know, if that's not in your vocabulary, we're talking about the moths and butterflies. So how do they do that? Well, they support the caterpillars that that feed on our native plants. And Douglas telling me that entomologist from the University of Delaware is actually getting more sophisticated all the time in learning new things. And his current argument is that there are certain key species that that provide most of the lepidopteran that our birds need, for example. And the top of the most important is the quercus, or the oaks. And his numbers here are based on oaks of the Northeast, but he's since been doing research around the country and is finding that it's holding up in terms of what are those key species that we need to put back into our landscapes if they're not there. And so, you know, when I see that 534, I think, wow, that's a lot of butterflies. But in fact, there are lots more caterpillars of moths than there are caterpillars of butterflies. We have 2,126 species of Lepidoptera, so that's both moths and butterflies, that have been recorded in the state of Texas, and 481 of those are butterfly species. So it's really like about 22% butterflies to the remainder being 78% or so being the moth caterpillars. Across North America, there are 14 times more moths than butterflies. So while we can see pollination maybe going on with some butterflies, that's not the big thing. Moths do a lot of pollinating. Of course, bees do a lot of pollinating. But the most important thing is that our major like tree groups are kicking out a lot of caterpillars that become bird food. And here's this cardinal with a teeny tiny caterpillar that it's transporting to its young. It hardly looks worth it. But the thing is that caterpillars are one of the most important energy transfer from plants to wildlife. And those caterpillars have their protein, they've got carotenoids in them, they're high in fat. And so without them, our bird populations are going to crash. And 96% of our North American land birds feed their young caterpillars. So they're crucial. And we're seeing steep declines in these numbers. If we lose the plants that support those insects, then we're really going to have a huge loss in biodiversity. And the interesting thing about these plants, and it gets back to what is a native, is that over time, plants want to survive. So they don't really particularly like being eaten. And they have evolved defenses, chemical defenses, so that really only a few different species of caterpillars can feed on certain sources, on certain plant sources. And if we lose one or the other, if we lose the plant or we lose the insect, we may lose that particular little part of the food web for the rest of time. I'd like to just have a look here, at these other things that are really good plants. And as I go through this talk, we'll look at, different plants, not necessarily these, but the cherries and the plums. So the Mexican plum is a great plant. Escarpment black cherry is a great plant. And the other one, interestingly, it's not really maybe a Bernie plant or even so much an Austin plant, but cherry laurel is good, especially if you're a little bit further east, although there are parts of Austin that it does really well in. There are different willows that do very well. And interestingly, besides willows, I don't think too many people plant willows, but yeah, every birder knows that that's a really good place to go looking during migration, because that's where a lot of the warblers are. And it includes our cottonwoods too, that particular family. Then our elms, so that would be our cedar elm primarily in our area, and also the American elm, which doesn't do so well. And this slide just shows why people like Nandina so much is because it doesn't get chewed on, and so it always looks fresh and neat, where these other guys do, but it doesn't seem to slow them down. They still do what they do, which is leaf out, and continue to grow. Ligustrum, there are a few generalist species that have managed to learn how to eat ligustrum. So you do see a little bit, maybe you could argue a little bit more wildlife value there. Oh, the other thing I want to say is the ulmus includes our hackberries too, which we'll address a little bit later. So before we really get into plants, I would like to just say sometimes we're not aware of all the different things that birds eat. We know that birds eat caterpillars, and we know that birds eat berries, and we know that birds drink nectar, particularly our hummingbirds and our orioles and some of our finches really like to come in for nectar. Coral honeysuckle is a great plant. Unfortunately, it has been hit pretty hard. It's not really so much a plant of our area as a little bit more East Texas. It probably didn't do very well over there either. But anyway, my suggestion to you is during migrations, these new hummingbirds are going to be on their way, whether we're ready for them or not. So this is the one time when you might want to go ahead and put out a feeder with 1 part sugar to 4 parts water, and make sure to change it out every few days, every 3 days or so, so that it's clean and fresh for them, because they're going to need it as they move through our part of Texas. Birds also, interestingly enough, eat sap. And I was out at one of our wonderful Travis County parks not too long ago, and I watched a yellow-bellied sapsucker, which is a winter bird here, tending its sap wells on a mesquite. And then the longer I watched, I noticed a little verdin coming in. It's kind of a little desert bird, and it was coming in and drinking at the sap well, but it might also be getting insects. So I know sometimes people get really worried about their trees being drilled on by these sapsuckers, but they generally target trees that are kind of on the way out anyway. And they are what's considered a keystone species up north, because as they move back north, if they have periods of cold, these birds will, little birds like warblers will actually drink at these sap wells, as will things like I've seen monarch butterflies drinking at sap wells. So birds, as we already saw, eat a lot of fruits and berries. And here's a robin with a sumac berry. Sumacs were huge this fall and winter for the birds. Other birds are pretty fond of nuts and seeds, and it might be things like a lesser goldfinch on a perennial or an annual sunflower. It could be a blue jay that's caching acorns. So it's actually, the research shows that a blue jay will stash or cache in the ground up through between 3,000 and 5,000 acorns in a season. And they don't find them all. They only find about 30%. And so the rest of those have a chance to germinate. So they're credited actually with replanting the forests of North America after the last little mini ice age about 12,000 years ago. So I've also watched, and this is something that it's really fun to do, is to start watching what the birds are eating in your yard. But watch to see little goldfinches. They'll even perch on your salvias to eat the seeds out of those salvias. It's like, where are the seeds in the salvia? And I've also seen them at lemon mint or Monarda citriodora. What's our regular name? Lemon mint, I guess, is, or bee balm, some people might call it. So it can be a really tiny seed, or it can be something as large as an acorn, depending on what bird it is we're talking about. So birds also eat foliage and buds. And like someone who was speaking earlier, kind of concerned about what the birds are going to eat until things really start getting going. Well, hopefully the buds will start coming out, because a lot of birds will eat fresh foliage and buds. Here's a bunch of little lesser goldfinches in my yard, and they're actually eating the leaves of plateau goldeneye, which is a nice composite kind of in the sunflower family. And the sunflower family is one of the categories that Douglas Talmy is really recommending that we plant more of. But did this plant look the greatest? No. Did it bloom? Yes. Did I think it was caterpillars at first? Yeah. So, but I just let it be, and it bounced back, and it was fine. So birds also, as we already mentioned, eat a lot of invertebrates. Even our hummingbirds, we might think they live on nectar alone, but nectar doesn't have any protein. And so I've even seen some numbers that up to 60% of their diet is insects. So some people nurse their hummingbirds through the freeze, other hummingbirds didn't make it. But the ones that did are out there doing their part, catching lots of insects. If you're looking for the insect here, it's right here. This guy up at Fort Hood managed to catch this picture of a black gin going after a gnat. And sometimes on a good day, you'll go out, you'll see little clouds of insects like high in your live oaks. And then if you watch, you might have a hummingbird, and it seems like it's just being very erratic, but in fact, it's catching the insects. So when we talk invertebrates, I mentioned caterpillars, but it's really, invertebrates, it would include all your arthropods, and that includes things like your millipedes, your spiders, your centipedes. I'm not an entomologist, so I can't tell you what else, but all those creepy crawlies that we may not recognize, they fall into the category of somebody probably likes to eat them. And depending on who you are in the bird world, you're probably going to go for vertebrates. And it could be something as small as a little anole, or it could be something as large as a skunk or a coot if you're a great horned owl. So all these things make the world go round, and it kind of all boils back down to what kind of habitat we're providing for our creatures. And one thing we have to start thinking about are some easy low-hanging fruit. Do we really need to have pesticides introduced into our backyards when what we're really ultimately, I would argue, trying to do is garden for insects or garden for arthropods. So there's definitely a big disconnect, and it's reinforced in the advertising world. Do we really need to spray our yards 4 times a year, to keep something knocked back? The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service says that homeowners put about 10 times the amount of pesticides on their yard per acre as farmers do. So farmers are a lot more careful because it costs so much, but for us, it's an easy, what we think is an easy fix. They also say that the calculations, these are old numbers, I haven't found anything newer, but that about 70 million birds a year die by direct ingestion of pesticides. But I'm sure that the impact of pesticides on our insects population is much, much more critical. So indirectly, birds are dying from lack of food. Birds need shelter. So we need to provide more vertical niches because different birds have preferences for different parts of the vertical environment, and so do insects. So, you know about dragonflies that like to wait on the edges of branches for a female to go by, and the same thing's true for butterflies. Well, we find preferences, and it doesn't hold up all the time, but this slide is good because it gives us some thought of, or some idea of where to look for species, and kind of wonder what are they finding at those particular levels. So the canopy, so your big mature trees are the ones that are going to count as your canopy trees. And a lot of our warblers that'll come through during migration do have a preference for the canopy. Others are lower warblers though, so we have both kinds. Tanagers kind of are an upper story bird. Robins, well, robins kind of move around a lot. But the area, and so here's our mid-story, things are up maybe to about 25 feet or so. And then we get into the understory, and the plants listed here are Mexican buckeye, which is a low-growing horizontal tree or large shrub, dogwood. So we have our rough-leaf dogwood, yaupon, and agarita. Those are examples of understory. And I would say that's kind of like between 0 and 7 to 8 feet off the ground. And that's the area that people who buy hill country properties seem to decide that is no longer essential, and they bulldoze it out so that they can show off their heritage oaks. And that's really unfortunate because that's where a lot of bird life occurs. And then the ground layer, so that would just be, whether it's St. Augustine or little blue stem or sedges or some kind of neat ground cover like horseherb, that's where a lot of other birds like to forage and spend a large part of their lives. So in our landscapes, a lot of times what we can encourage people to do is put more of this understory back in. And some ideas of evergreens for shelter. We, don't have that many evergreens, I don't think, when I start looking around. But mountain laurel, it's been sort of done, but I know for myself, I was very grateful to have this kind of shelter in my yard for birds to use, and mine came through pretty well. To the left of that is a possum haw. So that's the plant. You can see the red berries on it, but maybe not as good shelter. However, it does give a little bit, blocks the wind a little bit, and it is, when it leaves out, it is a nesting site for some birds. So here's a picture of a little screech owl who's being harassed by a blue-gray gnatcatcher because he hasn't found the best shelter that hides him. And that's what they do all day, is they're just trying to mind their own business, but the birds have other thoughts because they are little predators. So he could have stood a much better chance of a nice snooze if he had been over in this mountain laurel, which I do have a picture of them there. Shelter can also be something that we provide for our insects and invertebrates, So things like our little skinks, our little frogs, insects are all in this rich leaf litter that most people feel it's their civic duty to actually remove from their landscapes, which is really unfortunate. If I hope somebody here saw all the robins foraging in deep leaf litter before the snow came, because they know, and I was watching some today, they know about the insects that are maybe just about ready to emerge, and that's where they're finding them. And if we remove that leaf litter, we're removing nature's blanket, and a lot of places where these little vertebrates can survive because there's some moisture trapped there and also humidity that they need. So I would encourage you, without even any more plants, is to try to figure out a way to leave your leaf litter. Some caterpillars eat dead leaves during the winter month. And then many caterpillars, the ones that are going to be our little oak rollers that are going to be falling down from our oak trees, hopefully, in a few weeks, they're fortunately were underground, apparently most of them during the freeze, and so they probably made it through. So probably we should still have a good insect hatch. The entomologists that I've talked with around the country say what we really need is a lot of water. We need more rain, and mild temperatures. We don't want a late freeze because that'll really do a big number on these insects. So they say that most of those caterpillar pupae were in the ground and probably were protected by the freeze. We have birds that do spend the winter here, spotted towhees. They're a kind of hop scratch specialist. Plus I mentioned those robins, and they are taking advantage of this good leaf litter. If there's a way to leave cavities are in short supply, so that's a good thing to think about, so that your birds will have places to nest. If you don't want to do that, then you can switch to nest boxes, but we have primary cavity nesters like our red-bellied and down your way golden-fronted woodpeckers, and then we have secondary cavity nesters that move in after these guys have raised a brood, things like our titmice and our chickadees. Other things will take up in those cavities too. The little screech owls would be pretty thrilled with this size hole. In our yards, these are some places that we might see cardinals nesting, yaupons, mountain laurels, cedar elms, elbow bush, which is interesting because it's a shrub that really only goes to about 6 feet or so. Agarita has been a nest site. Cardinals actually nest fairly low, lots of times between 4 and 8 feet. Good, but here I contradict that by saying here's one in a sycamore tree that's pretty high up. But they need building blocks, so that's the other thing. When we don't remove all that vegetation from our landscape, we can supply them with the things they need to actually create their nests. Okay, so with all that, I was kind of going through the things that, the aspects of wildlife, the aspects that wildlife need to be successful: food, shelter, places to raise young. And now we're going to spend the rest of this time looking at some of the plants that are good choices for our landscapes. And one we really can't do without, unless your lot is not big enough, is some kind of big old live oak, which takes a while to get there, but as we saw, contributes a huge number of Lepidoptera, plus shade, plus places to raise young, perch sites, roost sites. So it's really important. A lot of these pictures are from the Wildflower Center. And here's that live oak understory, which provides maybe not as many different caterpillar species, but it provides nectar. In the case, this is a bunch of cedar sage, fragrant sumac or Rhus aromatica, which is a little perennial shrub that provides berries and nectar. And then back here is a bunch of elbow bush, which I mentioned as being a possible nest site, and also a place that birds like to forage under, where they can't be, caught by a marauding Cooper's hawk, which deserves its life too. Okay, cedar elm, here's another good plant, oftentimes an indicator of moisture soils. This picture was taken in the fall, so it is one of those trees that has a little bit of fall color, and you know, it supports over 200 insects. But one of the things that I don't know where I was all these years, but I was out bird watching one day, and I noticed it was probably early December, and I just noticed all these birds in the cedar elm samaras, so the little seeds, these little winged seeds, that's what they were eating. So here's a house finch chewing away and a female cardinal. So those were two. And so that is one big service that the cedar elm provides, is a lot of seeds for a lot of different birds. Then we get to our much hated, but really such a wonderful plant, the ash juniper. This one is really, it looks, you know, it's a multi-trunked plant. Some of these came through the storm with some damage because they did do a very good job of catching the snow, and the weight was just too much for them. But hopefully they can be pruned up and saved so they'll continue to provide their ecosystem services through the years. And this picture kind of shows, a lot of people say, well, nothing will grow under ash juniper. Well, it kind of depends on where that ash juniper is growing, whether it's a huge bunch of them all together where there's no shade, I mean, where it's all shade. This one is at the Wildflower Center, and they have a lot of different things growing underneath it, including cedar sage, basket grass, the Nolina texana, some native grasses, like here's out on the edge, a little blue stem. You know, there's some cedar sedge in there. So again, you can have a diversity of plants that are probably all going to provide for either the insects that birds eat or seeds, nectar themselves, plus the berries. And we all know the important relationship between the golden cheek warbler and the ash juniper, where they make their nests with the bark of the old growth ash juniper, which I've been told has to be, you know, 20 to 30 years old before it's going to shred like they need it to. And here's the papa bringing in a caterpillar. So junipers are popular with cedar waxwings, and those branches that fell over are actually making some of those berries more accessible. Here's a robin, mockingbird. Mockingbirds try to guard their stash from everybody else, but a big flock of cedar waxwings will do them in. And then here's a cardinal. Okay, so when it gets to our small trees, these are the ones that are maybe easier to decide, okay, I can put one in, you know, it's not like a big commitment of an oak or a cedar elm, but these are things that maybe you can introduce a little bit later, and it doesn't take long for them to provide some foods for birds. So our yopons are wonderful, and our possum haws. And the yopons, if you're familiar with Ricky Lennox's book, Ricky Lennox is, he's just retired, I guess, not too long ago, but he has a book called Range Plants of North Central Texas. And even though it says North Central Texas, I think it's like 90% of his plants in the book are relevant to where you and I live. Anyway, he says that berry production on a yopon in the sun is 19 times that what berry production is for a yopon in the shade. Of course, you have to have a female, but that's something to think about, is the more sun you give it, the more berries it's going to produce. Here's a possum haw at a friend's house, and it's covered with cedar waxwing. This is from a cold snap several years ago, and by the end of the day, they had totally cleaned her out. But it's kind of fun to notice the difference between the two. The yopon is a much more leathery, elliptical sort of leaf, and the berry placement is kind of different than the berry placement on a possum haw, which is deciduous. So these are more paddle-shaped leaves, but both produce a lot of good food for the birds. And I challenge you to go around town now to And look for those yopons and pasmas that still have berries, because like you said, the cedar waxwings have been out there doing a good job. But usually the ones that are left, it's because there is one really aggressive mockingbird who's guarding his stash. Another tree for either dappled shade, part shade, or full sun would be Texas persimmon. It's a great tree with this beautiful gray bark um, on the older trees that would rival crepe myrtle, but at least it's a native plant. It has soft leaves that kind of have curled edges, and it's a huge success with the birds. So here's a cardinal with stains from the persimmon fruit. The persimmons start getting ripe. This one, it's an unripe one from August. And when Meg Inglis, the NLCP coordinator, went back with me in September, they were ripe. So that's a Texas persimmon is a great plant to consider in your landscape. Flame leaf sumac, it gives you quite a dramatic showing of the blossoms. And then later on, of course, the leaves turn that beautiful red, and then you get the berry production. And you can see that if you don't have much soil, this is on a limestone slope, and there's not much soil, if any, there, and this plant's doing really well. So if you've got that kind of soil, maybe you can put a flame leaf sumac in. I will say that they do need more sun for better color and for better berry production, but they do pretty darn well as an edge plant. The plant that's over here to the left of it, and sometimes when it's blooming, you might get them mixed up. This is a huge evergreen sumac, which does really well in full sun conditions and is also a great berry producer. So here's a cardinal with flame leaf sumac berries. And this year was really interesting in our area because we had a lot of bluebirds come in because of the fires and the droughts out west is what we assumed. So we had, well, this is an eastern, but we had western bluebirds, a few, and flocks of mountain bluebirds, which are that beautiful sky blue. And there was a place out in Williamson County where there were, oh, I don't know, 40 or 50 of these birds, the mountain bluebirds, not this one. And they were all in the flame leaf sumac eating the berries. So those, if you have a place for a flame leaf sumac, I highly recommend it. Here's some things for early nectar. The Mexican buckeye is this plant on the left. You might see it in a full sun situation like this where it has a rather pleasing shape. You know, it kind of, I don't know, it just looks like an upside down triangle sort of thing. And these pretty blossoms, which some people probably think it's a red bud. Anyway, and then it has those little brown 3-lobe capsules later after these guys have gone away and the fruit has set. So that is really good plant for, it's a larval host plant for a particular butterfly, the Henry's elfin, gives a lot of nectar for insects. A friend of mine has one in her yard. She doesn't have a big yard. And even though warbler migration is a little bit later, it's like, you know, April to mid-May, she sees a lot of foraging activity from her warblers in her Mexican buckeye. Here's the red buckeye. I'm holding my breath like you all did. Those buds were getting pretty big because it's really earlier. It's earlier than the buckeye, the Mexican buckeye. I have one that looks like it is. The buds are still going to make it, it looks like. But this is critical food for those migrating black chins and ruby throats that'll be coming through. And I've been told, you know, typical nectar solution concentration is 20% because it's 4-to-1 dilution, but these guys are actually about 25% sugar concentration. So they give those hummingbirds a little extra boost as they move further on north. This plant is one that does defoliate later on in the summer, so you want to put it somewhere where you can maybe have something else to draw the eye later when it's looking pretty terrible. It looks like a stick basically. And I've seen these kind of defoliate too. It just kind of depends. Both both are well, this one's very, very drought tolerant. This one seems pretty drought tolerant to me. I don't give mine any extra water. But they're two different species. You've got an Mexican buckeye, Ugnadia speciosa, and red buckeye. And one thing I didn't say earlier is if you're new to native plants, you kind of want to ask for plants by their scientific name, because there are so many common names for plants you just can't, you don't know what it is you're buying if you're not careful. So do your research before you go shopping. Okay, for those of us who maybe did lose some plants in this freeze, and you're thinking, what am I going to put back? Well, American beautyberry, well, it's a big plant. Can get, like 7 feet tall and 7 feet around if you don't watch out. But it certainly provides a lot of services for the birds. It's a big hit. It doesn't, it blooms in the spring, just little tiny white flowers that you're hardly going to notice, which are of course food for pollinators, and they pollinate it. And then in the fall, you get these beautiful purplish berries, which are a big hit with our migrating fall birds. I have a list here of things that people have seen on them. Let's see. Tanagers, cardinals, mockingbirds, orioles. So this is a plant that does really well in part sun, 2 to 6 hours of sun, or it can be lightly shaded all day. And it's great to fill up a corner of a yard that maybe you didn't, maybe you're starting out and you just want to go slowly and you just want 1 or 2 plants. Well, this is one to really try. It does like a little bit more water to get established at least, and then you can kind of wean it off and see how it does, but it does like a little bit more water. Turk's cap, I'm probably, Bernie is notorious, I would guess, for its deer population, and the part of town I live in is the same way. And here is proof that this Turk's cap, which is, I would call it, shrub, or you might call it a perennial. Anyway, it's somewhat deer resistant. These are not caged, and they've managed to get this big, so they're doing pretty well. So Turk's cap is a great plant. You can do it freestanding like this. I never really considered that till I see this picture here that I took in my neighborhood. Or it can be really great effectively at the back of a border somewhere. But Turk's cap, as we know, is a big hit with hummingbirds. It doesn't bloom early. It starts blooming at the end of May, and then it doesn't shut down until November, and sometimes you can find a few blossoms that are lingering later on. And even when it's chewed, I wasn't really sure what this is. It might be grasshopper damage. They still bloom. And they're a big hit with our bigger butterflies like pipevine swallowtail and the sulfur butterflies. And the little fruit that they set is edible for people and wildlife. So everybody should have this plant. Even if you have some, you can have more. And it's easy for us, those of us who are sort of black thumb gardeners. Another plant that's pretty easy and it's got impressively quick growth is our white mistflower. The white mistflower, or chubby boneset, and here's the name, Adretina havanensis, is a fabulous plant for full sun, gets a little bit more dense and quite attractive, or part shade, doesn't require much water, but it might bloom off and on in the spring just a little bit, especially with some moisture. That's my experience. But then in the fall, it puts on its show in like late September and October, and you'll get a lot of butterfly activity. So here's a queen on it, and here's a plant in a pot. So that might be something you might want to try. This is at the butterfly exclosure at the Wildflower Center. So the minute those butterflies eclosure and when they come out, they immediately have a nectar source at certain times of the year. So to me, that would be a plant every yard should have because it would do well in Bernie. It does great here. Aromatic sumac, I mentioned a little bit earlier. It's sun to part shade to shade. It's deciduous. It does begin to colonize and form thickets. So for those of us who want more of it for free, it's a pretty nice plant to have. It does set dark red berries, which are kind of an earlier fruit, you know, like early to, I'd say early summer. And so it provides food for some of the birds that are over summering here. And you can contain it. This is a nice edge. And so it's been being pruned just a little bit. It looks very attractive in its space. So that's our Rus aromatica. It has a little shamrock shaped leaf. And it is in my yard, it is beginning to colonize. And to me, that's very exciting because I think I lost some of my near native Barbados cherry because they didn't make it. So this is in that same spot, and I think it's going to take over. Some flowering plants. I mentioned that wonderful plateau goldeneye earlier when it was being eaten by the lesser goldfinches. This is a plant that does kind of colonize an area too, but it's easy to pull out. Here's a picture when it's not quite ready to bloom. Here's a picture earlier in the season. Oh, I know, this was in August out at the Wildflower Center, and it was getting kind of dappled shade. And this is one in full sun beginning to come on. And then over here it is what it looks like when it's totally blooming. If any of y'all have ever been to County Line on the lake here in Austin, it's a twisty road that kind of goes down to 360, and it's just a blaze of color in the fall. And it is this plateau goldeneye, and the scientific name is Vigera dentata. Very easy to grow. You probably grow it from seeds. It may grow 3 to 6 feet tall, and it's open and kind of bushy, and birds really do like it. Okay. Frostweed, maybe it needs a new name because we shouldn't call our wonderful plants weeds, but frostweed is a plant that's kind of an acquired taste. It has beautiful white blossoms in the fall and has big leaves that are kind of deltoid shaped, long and deltoid, but there's like a whole little community of insects that eat on this plant. You'll see lots of butterflies that come in, and because there are butterflies there, you're also going to see lurking praying mantises. And then later they're going to set seed, and you're going to see birds like our little downy woodpeckers and orange-crowned warblers eating the seeds off of this plant. I see no reason why you should ever buy this, you know, because whoever has it probably has a lot of it and they could dig you some roots, or you can just get your own going from seed. When you have a big crop of it, it actually has a very nice perfume. And I was just showing this picture of one in my yard that grew up. I'm about 5'8", and this one's double my height. It's amazing how tall that plant is. So in good years, it might be something that you actually want to cut back a little bit. And if you cut it back, say in like June-ish or so, it'll still come back and bloom for you in the fall. And then this year was a spectacular year when all those stems froze and burst, and we had the whirls of ice everywhere. So, you know, if it's a butterfly magnet, just remember that birds like our ash-throated flycatcher, which some people have breeding in their yards, do like fresh adult butterflies. Salvias of any kind, our native salvias, are a wonderful addition to your nectar garden. Cedar sage is a little more fragile. It's the one that does so nicely in the cedar duff under our ash junipers. Here's a picture of what it looks like at my friend Meg Inglis's house. And tropical sage, Salvia coccinea, is another one that some people actually keep kind of as a low ground cover until they want it to bloom. I have found Salvia coccinea to be very popular as a nectar source for Gulf fritillary butterflies. And I found that Carolina wrens really like the caterpillar or the pupa of the chrysalids of the Gulf fritillary. Okay, grasses. Grasses are really important for the seeds they produce, the fact that they are a soft nesting material, and that some birds actually will even nest under grasses. In the hill country, we have a bird, the rufous crowned sparrow, which actually has been known to nest underneath the arching leaves of Lindheimer or big muley. And this was a American robin collecting feathergrass in my yard for use in its nest. Mexican feathergrass, this Nacella tenuissima, is really a native of the Big Bend area, West Texas. And grasses also provide shelter for insects. So here's the big muley, which is very popular in the landscape trade right now. So that's one you definitely can establish in your yard if you have the right lighting conditions. It doesn't do well I don't find it does well in like dappled shade under oak trees. It needs a little bit more light, and it does respond to more moisture. Out in nature, you see it kind of lots of times in wet meadows. And then over here is another just a way that people are using it in a natural area in our town called Mills Pond at Wells Branch, where they're really encouraging a lot more natives and introducing a lot more natives. So that's a fabulous grass in the landscape. Side oats grama is one that, again, it's a good little seed grass. It does really well in rock gardens or small meadows. And it's just very well behaved. I would probably divide it if it gets too dense to keep with that sort of delicate look. So here it is growing. It's 2 to 3 feet tall, kind of in a corner situation here where it's a little bit dappled light, and out here in full sun. But should probably use more of it. Here's one we really don't hear too much about, but this past year was an excellent year for southwestern bristlegrass. And you can get, I've checked, I hadn't checked recently, but I did like this summer to see if you could get this grass seed, and you could at the time or one of the ceterias from Native American seed, but just watch for it. This seed is small. It kind of reminds me of millet that you buy at a store for your birds, but it would be perfect for these small seed eaters like our painted bunting, which will be here towards the end of April. So again, it's one of those that you can just gather seed for it. It's mainly a woodland plant, so that's something nice for those of us who struggle with what to do in our shade. The richer the soil, the less water that's going to be needed. And it likes disturbed areas. So it's something to think about. Then there are the plants that people love to hate, but the birds think very differently. And that would be, for one, the Virginia creeper. So we didn't have such a great crop this year, but last year was phenomenal. And everywhere I went, I saw birds in the Virginia creeper. So this Virginia creeper had the decency to be on a horizontal limb. So it was very easy for this little eastern bluebird to forage. Thrushes during fall migration are going to be big fans of it too. But a lot of birds will eat the berries. Hackberries, hackberries are very, well, they're really good wildlife trees. They do have a tendency to suppress other growth around them, but they more than make up for it in their value to birds, whether it's a wintering woodpecker like our northern flicker, whether it's an oriole during spring migration or a dickcissel during migration too. That would be spring migration. So its berries will be setting, I guess, throughout the season but they persist into the winter for birds like this. So I've talked to garden designers and they say, yeah, you can just trim it to make it look a little more organized, and it can be a nice tree in your landscape. It is a kind of warty looking tree. The bark is a little strange and the leaves are a little coarse, but it's one that really, as a larval host plant and as a berry producer, it's great. Now here's one that might be a little bit more of a stretch, and that's our ragweed. And I'm just saying the birds love ragweed. So I can't imagine, well, I have some in my yard, but most people are probably not going to put ragweed in their yard. But look, we should call it ambrosia. We shouldn't call it ragweed. And because this cardinal thinks it's great. I was at a location Commons Ford, and the bushes were practically shaking with all the cardinals in it. Another plant that's really popular with the birds and kind of moves around, you know, if a bird pooped a seed over your house, you might be lucky and have a plant come up, but it seems to move around, is the Phytolacca americana, and some people call it pokeweed and some people call it pokeberry, but it's a very popular plant with birds. So, you know, what we just have to do, if we can't put some of those plants like pokeberry and ragweed, we just need to appreciate those wild places that we have, because they are supporting bird life that maybe in places that we normally would want to tidy up. So in some, you know, to encourage our backyard birds and to help those migrants as they're moving on through, is to think of ways to replace some lawn with maybe some shrubs, some understory, reduce or totally eliminate pesticides. Just try it and see what, you know, what happens. Add variety of native plants, but maybe plant in bigger swaths so the birds will see what you've got. Leave leaf litter. So I hope I've persuaded you that leaf litter is a good thing. And I'm even saying that it's better not to chop it up and, you know, those leaves into smaller pieces, because you might be chopping up the chrysalids of those moths. But leave litter if you can. If you can't leave it all, at least you can put some in your flower beds. And reduce deadheading. So that's where you cut off your you know, your flowers so that you'll have repeat blooms, at least somewhere along the line. Think about leaving those flowers to set seed so that the birds can perch on them. That's very satisfying to watch birds come down and eat your seeds out of your lemon mint or out of your purple cone flowers. One last thing is to keep cats indoors, because I know that's maybe doesn't have anything to do with gardening, but they kill between 1.3 and 4 billion birds in the US alone per year. And it's really much safer for them to be indoors. Their lives will be longer, or maybe consider a catio to keep the birds happy and safe and the cats happy and safe. So with that, I would encourage you to think about gardening for birds and appreciate all that other wildlife that may come in too. And with that, we'll open it up for questions. We've got a little bit of time, and what Lorraine and I thought we'd do is I would check the chat and see what questions you might have. All right. Okay, I do not know the answer about the loquat tree. I don't know if somebody else wants to chime in, but it's not really a native. Let's see. Oh gosh, Val, I'm not sure what you're referring to, but persimmons look like little round fruits about like that. And lantana berries are pretty small. They're like maybe 2 or 3 lantana berries to a raisin. That would be about what I would say. Yeah, lesser goldfinches also eat mealy blue sage seeds. Anybody else have anything they've noticed? I've noticed them eating the seeds out of salvias tropical, the salvia coccinea. And Lucy is saying hers eat out the yucca flowers, does that mean they're eating those black seeds out of the yucca flowers, Lucy? Or are they just eating the flowers?
Not the seed, they reach inside the flower itself and eat. I don't know if it's the pollen or if there's something in there they can eat, or maybe there's a bug. I don't know, but they eat out of the flowers itself.
Lucy, are you saying the red yuccas? Or are you talking about like your yucca rubicola or something?
The red yucca, the red
Oh,
yucca.
okay. Oh, okay. Well, I'm gonna have to watch for that. Y'all, that's the kind of thing that makes it so fun, just being out in your yard, working in the yard, and then noticing what birds eat.
And the hummingbirds drink out of the yucca, and then the phoebes pull the hairs off the green part of the yucca, the branch, I don't know what they're called, to come out. I guess they're like the leaves. They pull the hairs off of those to make nests.
Huh.
I watched them do that.
Okay, so Nelwyn has a question. What would you suggest to use for scorpions if you don't use pesticides? Ooh, I'm gonna have to ask other people, because we don't have that problem here too much. We had a place out in the hill country, and we just killed them, by smushing them. But if you have a real problem, you may not have a choice. And I don't know, does anybody have a suggestion who has this problem with scorpions? Well, I would say try to limit it and just have, if you can do it just on the interior of the house. The problem with even doing the exterior is that your little Carolina and Buick's friends, which you might have more of, they love to go around the edge, the perimeter of your house, and they're looking for spiders and other things. And, they probably eat the scorpions too, actually. I'm just guessing, I'm not sure. So I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for you on that. Let's see. Somehow I don't think my beauty berries, okay, somebody says their Texas Buckeye is doing great. That's good news. I don't think, Lucy doesn't think her beauty berries will make it. They look pretty frozen. I don't know, I guess we'll find out. I hope that they do. Somebody says, Rita is saying, I bet she's saying that the lesser goldfinches eat Engelmann daisy seeds, I think. Oh yes, and Gary says lesser goldfinch will also eat the seeds from Mexican hat. Yeah, they really like it. There's that Reimers Ranch, which is one of our Travis County parks. I highly recommend y'all go there sometime. It's got a great view over the Pedernales. It's out by West Cave Preserve. Anyway, there's a nice field of what was Mexican hat, and that's where you have like a dozen lesser goldfinches in there. Oh, and Gary also says scorpions are good fried to eat. I don't know if he's pulling our leg or not on that. Okay, so in terms of deadheading, yes, especially for things like purple coneflowers, to use scissors is the best way to get those seed heads off. Oh yes, Keely says that lesser goldfinches eat chard in their raised planter beds. Yeah, I've heard that from some other friends that they love Swiss chard. They're just crazy about it. So this is fun. Okay, I've been told you can use 50% vinegar as an alternative to weed killer. Is that, no, that wouldn't, I think that would be all right, but I do know that vinegar is pretty strong and you don't want to get it on you, right? That's what I've heard. But I don't think it'll be a problem to the birds because it's going to go right into the ground. Other than whatever, well, I don't think it'll be a problem. I will tell you though, somebody was saying earlier about dandelions, that somebody was telling them to get rid of all their dandelions. You should see the number of birds like Savannah sparrows that like little dandelion seeds. And, if they're going to be slim pickings, that's where you might see them. So anyway, I try to learn, what they say, a weed is a plant you haven't learned to love yet. Well, that's the attitude I try to have. Okay, so Donna says she uses a piece of paper to pick up any scorpions that find their way inside and then throws it outside there they can be eaten by something else. Oh, and you know who eats crazy things like that, although it's not going to come on demand, is great horned owls. They'll eat, I don't know about scorpions, but I know they eat centipedes. That's crazy. What can we plant to replace the oaks we have lost because of oak wilt? You know, Felicia, that would be, everybody would have their ideas. Um, oh, and Meg Inglis has there are some of the oaks that are very oak wilt intolerant, but I'm right now can't thinking of them. Can somebody else chime in? White oaks. Yeah, so, but you know, I think there is a case to be made for using some of our more ornamental trees and going for a sunny yard, you know? Then you won't have oak branches falling on your house when they're weighed down with all this snow. I mean, I'm just being a little playful here, but I would look at cedar elms, you know, because they're good. I would weigh pecans, although they do, you know, drop a lot of leaves, or branches, but the birds really like them. I guess I would just go through my big trees and think about which one's going to be the most well-behaved. I think cedar elms are actually pretty well-behaved, but that's my take on it. Other people would have another take. Okay. So Cynthia suggests that because scorpions fluoresce under blacklight, you could take a flashlight and look in the rocky formations and I guess gather them up and give them to your chickens. But so that's an idea. Oh, chinkapin oak, I guess. So Cynthia says other oaks just take longer to die. I don't know if I can be part of that conversation. Well, I think we're at the end of people's comments, but it sure has been fun to get all your comments. And I guess that's probably made us all like lesser goldfinches a little bit more because we understand more of what they eat, what they're looking for. But it's been a pleasure being here. And Lorraine, I guess I should turn it back to you to any other comments that you might have.
Excellent job, Jane.
Well, thanks.
I took lots of notes.
Good.
Thank you so much. And I think if we have any leftover questions, we are going to get in touch with Lorraine so she can direct them to you. But this is fascinating, and thank you so much. Thank you.
All right. Well, I hope it was fun.
Excellent. All right, everyone. We're going to be signing off. Jane, have a wonderful evening. Lorraine.
You all do too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
Oh, you're
Sure
welcome.
enjoyed it.
Y'all were fun.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Excellent.
See you at State NIPSOT.